Good morning to everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Act questions that we find within the Common Assessment Standard. This is a weekly drop-in session where we're going to be talking about the questions that we have within the requirement. And I'm really pleased to be joined by the team at Cube Construction Consultants again, who joined us within our part one webinar that we did. And in here, we're going to be asking them to provide their insights, their kind of views on the questions that we have within the requirements and how suppliers and contractors can answer those with the evidence that they may already have or may need to start looking at amending and tweaking to meet the requirements of the Building Safety Act and the building regulations within the requirement. So I'm really happy to be welcomed by Nicola and Mark again this week. So thank you to both of you. So what is the agenda for this session? So we're going to do a quick recap on the first part. So we're going to just do 2 or 3 slides on what we covered last time. We're going to also be talking about what is the Common Assessment Standard and what are the questions, and we're going to go into how those flow within the requirement. So right from the first question where you're essentially saying I'm in or I'm out, and hopefully if you've already seen part 1, you know that you're in the requirement. We're also going to be looking at the top rejected questions that we have. So we've been running this requirement for about 6 or 7 months now, and we know which questions seem to be causing a bit of a problem within the industry in terms of answering. And that's what we're going to be talking about with the team at Cube around how are they answered, how would you view these? How would you kind of support suppliers or get them to think about how they should be answering these when submitting? And then we'll also again be talking about what this means to you and how we can move forward with guidance and support through the platform, but also the guidance that we have on our website as well. Okay, so we'll make a start on what we've covered in part 1. And in part 1, we covered where this has all come from. So back in 2024, in the July, the Build UK updated the Common Assessment Standard to include building safety as a new requirement into the platform. At that point, it had an advisory status. And as we talked about in that first part, it will be getting a mandatory status with us in the coming weeks, which will communicate to you individually at that point when it is included in the status calc. So what that means to you as a contractor is at that point, you will have either had to have said yes and have passed all the questions within the requirement, or you've said no because you've understood from part 1 of the webinars that we've done that you're not in scope of the Building Safety Act and the building regs, and therefore you don't need to answer those questions and it won't impact your gold or your platinum status. So that's where this has come from. Obviously, version 4, it was advisory, so it didn't impact gold or platinum. But as we've moved into kind of V5 and July 2025, later this next month, we'll be changing that to including it in the status calc. So again, really important that we start to think about how we're going to say yes to this question, how we start to answer those questions, and how we move through. We also talked about kind of the challenge that we'd seen so far from a yes/no perspective and the understanding of what that meant. So in that webinar, we talked about the feedback that we were getting. Around 59% of suppliers at the moment they've answered this question have opted out. So they've said basically that they don't fall under the realms of the Building Safety Act or the building regs. Only 3% have passed and 7% have answered a yes answer but still to pass. So again, really high number of people that are saying it doesn't apply. And when we look at that data, it's not there's some misalignment there from an expectation perspective, whether that's work categories or even just down to the company names that probably they should be thinking about whether they're in scope or not. We then also spoke about the main contractor deadline, and this has been on our socials for the last couple of weeks and will continue to be through the rest of this year. But our main contractors now have a really important message to all of their supply chains to say, of those that you can see in the image on the right hand side, to say that from October the 1st, they will be demanding that you've answered these questions and that you have passed to work on building safety related projects. So if you've not already seen that video, there is a QR code on the screen that you can see here, and also a letter that they've sent out to those supply chains in understanding why they need you to complete it. There is more information on our website as well. So if you go to our website and click on BSA, you can see information there. And again, you'll be able to see the full video as well as the letter as well. And then lastly, the main bulk of the session last week was the great work that the guys at Cube had done in presenting a clear understanding of where people should be deciding or whether they're in scope or out of scope of the Building Safety Act and the building regs. And we've received some really positive feedback from people who attended the session that it's allowed them to go back into their organisations and have conversations around, does this apply to us? Are we in scope of the Act? Are we a duty holder under the building regulations? And do we really need to be thinking about this? So we covered a lot of content in there, and Mark and Nicola did a great work in answering questions and supporting you through that journey. So again, if you've not seen part one, I would highly recommend going back to week one and really looking at that and seeing whether you are in scope or not in scope and understanding that before moving forward to the questions. Although this session will definitely help you in understanding, if you do say yes, what you will then need to cover. So again, from my perspective and the team at Construction Line, thank you so much to the guys at Cube, because the content was brilliant, and hopefully we'll have a similar session today. That's a bit of a recap on last time when we did the first webinar. But what are we here to talk about today? And the predominantly around that is the CAS questions, and the questions that if you say yes, what are you going to have to do? So as we've mentioned, this first question that you're presented within the requirement is, are you in or are you out? Do you do work in relation to the building regulations or do you not? And the question that you'll see is on the right-hand side. So that's exactly the wording and the content that you'll see. And obviously that answer from a yes or no then will decide how you move forward with the requirement. So if you answer no, you can change that answer at any point. So if any of you on the call today that have maybe already gone into this requirement and answered no historically, you can go back into that this afternoon or after the call today, and you can change that answer to yes if you believe that you are in scope of the building regulations and the Building Safety Act. So again, really, really important. Just because you answered no, maybe back in May or in April or even earlier, you can go back in and change that answer to yes. You do not need to wait until your renewal period, which will be in 12 months from the point in which you get that no answer, to reaffirm that. So you can change that at any point. And I would recommend anyone goes in and does that, even if it is literally just to look at what questions then follow. So just because you change your answer from no to yes won't take your status away in the requirement. So I would highly recommend, even if you're not sure, go in and just change that answer to yes and see what questions then appear when you give that answer. But what happens if you do say no? And we did cover this in part one, so I will cover it again really quickly, is you do get what we call a verified non-applicable status on that requirement, which is quite different to how our other requirements work. So for those of you who've been in the platform, you'll see that most requirements have a solid green circle with a white tick. When you've opted out or said this doesn't apply to us, which is the case in this requirement, you would have a white circle with a green outline and a green tick. So that indicates to you that you've opted out and you've basically said, no, we don't work in this realm. But more importantly, it does indicate this to your main contractor if you happen to be aligned with one of them in their supply chains. And so what that does mean is it's visible, so they can see that opt out. So if you're tendering for work, whether that's through Marketplace or wanting to maybe get on the supply chain of a main contractor, or you already are on the supply chain of a main contractor, it's possible that you may impact your future opportunities with that main contractor because they can see that you've opted out and they're saying that basically you don't do any work that would be considered under the regulations. And you should carefully consider that. Just because today you're maybe not doing that type of work, if you ever think you will, or you maybe historically have, you should really consider going in there and at least trying to pull the things together to be able to answer those questions. Because if you are in a situation where you do need to be saying yes, I think the data that we're seeing from a rejection perspective in terms of how many submissions it takes to get through, and some of the conversations we're going to have with the guys at Cube as we move through the webinar this morning, it's not that easy to pass if you've not got stuff already aligned to the building regulations or the Building Safety Act. There is a lot of evidence that you've probably got that relates to CDM, but that's not gonna pass, and we'll talk about that as we go through the rest of the session this morning. So if you've answered no, or you intend to answer no, please consider those actions carefully, because it could impact wider compliance with main contractors and opportunities moving forward. Okay, so what you've said, yes, you've said I am in scope of the Building Safety Act. So what then happens? The next question you're then presented with is our 99,001 exemption question. So For those of you that have completed quality or environmental or health and safety in the requirements in the past, you will notice that we've had exemptions in there that basically say if you've got an ISO certificate or a standard, you don't have to answer these questions because they're technically exempt because you've proven competence through another certificate, assessment body, or scheme, or another avenue. And this is no different. The only difference here, I would say, is that there's very little people with this at this moment in time. I'm aware of 2 or 3 organisations at main contractor level that have 99,001 at the moment. But there is a lot of people starting to get more interested in it and starting to get the process started of getting it as a standard. So for most of you on the call today, this isn't going to be a question that you're saying yes to. But what I would recommend is if you want to understand more about the standard, go away, get a copy of it, understand it within your own business units, because it might be something that you want to work towards. What's one thing we are seeing in the data is a lot of people are submitting their 9001 certificate, not their 99,001 certificate, and they're not to be confused. In order to have 99,001, you already have to have 9001, and the additional scopes of the built environment are part of 99,001 and are a separate certificate. But you do have to have 9001 already in order to have 99,001. So it's kind of a step or an upgrade from 9. But just the main thing really is there. Please don't submit your 9001 because it will get rejected. But it is a good standard, and it will mean that all the questions we're now going to talk about as we go through the rest of this webinar, you won't have to answer any of them, because this would be one of those classic exemption requirements where, like quality and environmental, if you've got 14,001 or 9,001, there may be one question on who your quality manager is, but beyond that, you're not going to answer policy arrangements or declarations of information within the requirement. So again, probably not one for you today, but something to think about in the future as you start to get more versed with building safety and how your company wants to align with the quality management systems of it. Okay, so for the majority of you, we'll work on the scenario that you've not said yes to that and you've said no. What will then happen is you'll start to be populated with questions in relation to the Building Safety Act and the building regulations. And what I've done at the bottom is started in the kind of purple and the blue, is just present you with some of the questions that we have around in this requirement. So you can start to see there that we ask you about your arrangements. We're asking for evidence of your arrangements and your procedures and your documentation, etc. And those questions flow through. So you'll be asked a yes/no question, and then you'll have to then provide the evidence or the arrangements that then backs that up. It's really important to consider at this point as well that most of these questions are generic. They're not specific to a duty holder at this point, and they're not specific to whether you work on high risk buildings or not. So most of these questions that you'll see here are predominantly aimed at all duty holders, so contractor, principal contractor, designer, and principal designer. They are not scoped out to just be specific to an individual duty holder, and we're going to come on to how that works on the next slide. Oh, sorry. And on the next slide, then you've got the duty holder questions. So we'll be then asking you which duty holder you fulfill under the regulations. So you can select all 4, or you can select 2, or you can select 1, but you do have to make at least one selection. So again, here you'll then get questions that are specific to that duty holder at that point, flowing for the rest of the assessment. So if you pick contractor and design, you'll be getting specific questions driven at contractor and designer responsibilities. If you pick designer and principal designer, you'll be getting the same. So again, really, really important you understand which ones you're selecting. And as we're going to come on to the common themes, make sure your selections are actually based on what you do or what you will be doing. And we have had scenarios where people are picking multiples because they want to have more statuses, but then unable to evidence the information within the requirement. So again, really, really important you only pick what's actually in scope of the work that you do or intend to do, and not something that you will do in 5 years' time, as an example, because you're not going to have the evidence available to demonstrate that. And then the final kind of selection question that we have within the requirement is, do you work on high risk buildings? And going back to the first webinar that we did with the guys from Cube, all those questions that we've asked up until this point have all been based on construction projects in relation to the building regulations and the Building Safety Act. They have not been specifically driven at the additional criteria that then sits on the high risk building side. So at this point, you'll be asked if you do work on any high risk buildings, and at that point will be more questions that then flow in to the requirement. as a result of that. Again, also dependent on duty holder. So there is one or two questions that flow in regardless of duty holder. But then there are specific questions that then roll in dependent on contractor, designer, principal designer, etc., which you would then need to answer. The reason why this question is kind of a bit further down the questionnaire and not at the top is with the amount of opt-outs we're seeing or people not sure whether they should be saying yes or no. If this question was placed towards the top of the questionnaire directly below the yes no question, we would probably see that a lot more people would be saying no, that they're not in scope because of the idea that it only applies to high risk buildings. And we spoke about that in part one, that there is a massive misconception that this only applies to stories, buildings of 18 meters or 7 stories, or in Tower Hamlets in London or wherever it might be. So again, it's really, really important that we understand that this isn't about high risk buildings on its own, it's about all buildings, and that there's specific additional scopes or questions that we will ask based on high risk buildings later on in the questionnaire. So that's the flow of the questions and how they appear and how they're staggered. But what we wanted to do today was really talk about the most rejected questions that we have, and really try to understand and unpick why they're rejected, and get the guys from Mark and Nicola's perspective on why they believe that might be happening, how they would support a client or talk it through with a supplier in how they should think about this question, and then also provide our verification or assessment criteria to you as well. So you've got a really good understanding of what they look like and how we would work around them in terms of our assessment times as well. So the first question that we've got is, please provide your procedures for providing appropriate supervision, instruction, and information to your workforce and key subcontractor roles under your control. So in this question, it's currently the top rejected question that we have within the requirement. And the reasons that we've got for that question being rejected the most is not addressing the relevant legislation and standards. So what we are finding when people have submitted evidence to this question specifically, there's a lot of CDM references to the regulations, whether that's contractual or duty holder responsibilities under CDM, but there is very little, if not any, actual support or focus on the legislations in relation to the Building Safety Act or the building regulations or wider industry standards. So they're unable to show that they've understood how the legislation impacts their duty in this specific question. Also, a failure to read and respond to the question in terms of workforce and subcontractors. So we're not just after what you directly do, but also how you monitor that with your subcontractors as well. And then omitting one of the required groups. So again, going back to the first group, it tends to be steered in one direction, mainly at the workforce, but potentially not looking at subcontractors. However, there has been cases where it's only looking at subcontractors and not looking at their own workforce in terms of that supervision, instruction, and information. So that's kind of the common reasons that we have for rejections at the moment. And in terms of acceptable evidence, I'm going to leave that on the screen at the moment. But Mark, I'd like to bring you in at this point, if that's okay. And from your perspective, and Nicole as well, how have you seen that question from your perspective? Because we've been working together to kind of just understand how the questions work in the platform and how we present them. And it's just really interesting to get your point of view and how you would interpret that from a consultancy perspective and providing the information down to a supplier.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think initially what I would say is think very seriously about your current role. Don't try and expand in terms of where you want to be. Think about what you do. Think about what process you currently have. You will have mechanisms in place for clear communication and accountability. So think about supervision, instruction. How do you deal with that internally? How do you deal with that with your supply chain? What's the method of communication? Is that formal records? Is it progress meetings? Is it briefing meetings? There's an awful lot of things that can fall into this category that can relate to the scale of your business. So it doesn't have to be a big grand policy and procedure, which is disproportionate to what you do. Of course, some companies will have a higher level of complexity, but it's really about thinking about the management of information. So how do you communicate that? How is it updated? And how do you manage the supervision of that information or the works? And like Tim said, think about how you deal with that going outwardly, but also how you deal with that internally and through your supply chain. How do you monitor how your subcontractors supervise their works? So It's kind of really get back to basics in terms of what you currently do. I'm sure you will have structures in place for this. And if you feel it's slightly informal, then think about what are the simple steps to formalize that and then provide evidence.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the other thing to take away as well is, and this is going to be a common theme as we talk about probably most of the questions, is you like Mark said, you've probably got things in place already which kind of get very close to the evidence that we would be looking for if it was kind of tweaked or amended to kind of scope into the Building Safety Act or building regs. Um, but we're not looking for something that you've probably already done six, seven, eight, nine times. We need to be able to see that you've thought and you've amended and you have the process in place to do. We are at the start of a journey here with most of you on being able to provide the evidence to satisfy these questions. And as we talk about that and as we move forward, a lot of you will be creating things that maybe you've not had the opportunity to enact and maybe demonstrate through actual a physical project. So, from an assessment perspective, we need to be able to see that you've thought, you've engaged, you've implemented within the organization, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've gone out and done it five, six, seven, eight times with on a project with a contractor with a client, because the intention to do something at this point shows that you've thought and you've implemented and you've had those discussions internally and you have a process to deal with it. We know a lot of you probably have not got to the point where you've made some of these changes and enacted on them. And I think, Mark, we were talking about that yesterday, weren't we? That it's really important at this point we get you on the ladder.
Yeah.
In a year's time or 2 years' time, it might be that the assessors start to push a little bit harder for actual practical evidence that demonstrates you've done a lot of this, every week on every project you've ever worked on. But at the moment, it's more about satisfying the requirement that you have something in place and that you know what to do as and when those scenarios play out within the projects that you're working on. Is there anything you want
Yeah.
to add on that at this point, Mark, just based on what I just said?
I think really just generally as the conversation goes on now with the questions, there's probably five key areas I think that people should ask themselves before responding to each question. And the first one is, of course, just be very clear about your duty holder roles because that dictates the obligations and therefore the processes you need to put in place. So be very clear and objective about your duty holder obligations. Understand what they mean to your business, and then you're effectively identifying at that point the process that you need to have in place to comply. Refer back to the evidence and guidance because the guidance that's provided is good. It will allow you to then trigger and think about what you do or need to do. Of course, Tim's just reiterated this. Not everything is about hard evidence. This can be about intent. Although, of course, if you do have policies and procedures in place, the evidence is the first point to go to. Think about how these requirements are relative to your works. That's a really important one. We all belong to companies of different shapes and sizes, but everything that you do is relative to the works you do and the obligations you have. So we do not have to be all things to all people. We don't all have to prove that we can build the shard. This is about us proving that we have policies, procedures, and structures in place that we can evidence or show intent that we can operate in a way that meets our obligations as duty holders. And of course, finally, every time you are looking to respond to a question, just remember it's not CDM. We are talking about the Building Safety Act. This ultimately is about the safety of a building, most of which relates to the integrity of what we do to prove it's compliant with building regs. And therefore, we need to have procedures and evidence in place to show that we are competent and capable to do that.
Bro, thank you very much, Mark. And we'll move on to the next question, which, again, as we talk through, I think some of the things we just spoke about will be common throughout, especially the CDM topic. So the
Yeah.
next two questions that we've got are kind of bunched together because they're kind of next to each other, which is please provide your arrangements for managing and recording key competencies. So in the first webinar that we delivered, the guys at Cube presented a lot of information on skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors, and how important that was from a demonstration perspective. Not only for your own workforce, but also subcontractors, so how you got those arrangements in place. And then we also, there's a follow-up question to that, which is providing the evidence which demonstrates your systems for managing those key competencies through skills, knowledge, and experience. And again, for this question, this is something that we would expect to see evidence of, that you've got a mechanism to record the competences of individuals within your organization. It's not an intense scenario where we've talked about with the first question around arrangements or policies. So going to the common reasons for rejections, we're seeing a lot of things that the how is missing. So we're seeing that there may be a matrix, but the distinction between those arrangements and how it's implemented are not necessarily always aligned. Again, some of the evidence is not specific to building safety or the building regs. So there might be some evidence in there that suggests they've got competencies, but it's more driven at CDM. Behavioural requirements within competency have not been covered. So again, Mark will be interested to get your thoughts on that one, because I think it's the newest one that will probably jump out to most people when we talk about skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Evidence of fire specific training is missing if you're working in that environment or you need that specific training to the work that you do. Again, we're talking about CDM here, so a lot of the kind of evidence that's been submitted is around CDM, or it's out of date and does not reflect current standards. And then the last one, which is interesting, because I guess as we move into this kind of more AI-driven world, Chat GPT and various other systems, Copilot, etc., where we're seeing generic or AI-generated kind of documentation or policy. And this probably applies to most questions in all fairness, but we're seeing it more in this one, where the company will address issues but failing to provide practical steps. So, not really thinking about or reading potentially what the AI is generating or submitting in. And in some cases, actually seeing the evidence with the AI logo within it as well. So again, just they're the main reasons for rejection of these specific questions. And I guess my gut reaction is this is probably because it's close linked to some of the SSIP questions we have around training and competence, which is why we see so much of a CDM link in there. But Mark, over to you really. How would you view this question from your guys' perspective in terms of consultants and contractors, and then how would you see it from an evidence perspective?
I think if I was responding to this, I think my first thought would be a demonstration of what we understand. So how do we understand what our obligations are with regard to this? As duty holders, we've got an obligation to monitor and present evidence regarding the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours of those that we employ. But there's also an obligation, which is often misunderstood, which is to understand how your supply chain are managing this process also. So just that statement of awareness takes you a long way to demonstrating how you are going to manage skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And then we can default back into standard templates and forms that I'm sure most of us have. So a training plan, a forward intent of how we intend to train and develop and upskill our employees, historic records of training. Training can take many forms. It could be a daily briefing, a toolbox talk. It could be a trade association presentation. It could be trade-specific training and certification. So for me, it's really about understanding what our obligations are as either a designer, contractor, PC or PD, demonstrating that you have that knowledge and you've got a mechanism of how you are going to manage that. Again, some of this will be intent because it's about moving forward as well. So demonstrating evidence, what you have in place, hard data, hard facts, training, certification, knowledge, and so on. But then think about behaviors. When you layer behaviors in, there's a fundamental obligation as duty holders when it comes to behaviors, and that is not to accept non-compliant work. You must never accept non-compliant work, either in terms of process, design, or construction. And that can be reflected on how you operate as a business. So it gives you an opportunity then to bring behaviors in. So it could be, for example, we have the following process, which demonstrates we've got a knowledge and understanding, but our behaviors are such that this is what we will do if this happens. You have a demonstration of how you connect to your obligations and how you will manage it.
Cool. And I think the next thing I'd just like to add to that as well is obviously there's organizational capability through skills, knowledge, and experience, but also down to the individual as well. And there's lots of work being done in trade bodies all around the sector to define what they mean by either organizational capability or individual capability. Some of them have done quite a bit of work and actually pushed on a little bit in terms of getting some frameworks out and some assessment scopes out. Some of them are a little bit more further behind. But one of my personal recommendations would be if you are affiliated or would want to be affiliated with any of these trade body organizations or steering groups, to try and understand how you can demonstrate that more cleanly, and because it is an industry problem that I know that a lot of them are trying to work through, then please reach out to those types of organizations because they are trying to at least provide somewhat of a framework around those skills, knowledge, and experience and how they would define it within each of their sector groups. I think, Mark, that's something you've probably come across as well as in your work as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, take advantage of the support that's there to enable you to get a framework of evidence for all aspects of SCARE.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then if we talk about the acceptable evidence just really quickly as well. So, talking about a training need analysis or policy or procedure which outlines that, what Mark spoke there about, which was really important about just going back to basics and understanding what we need to be achieving, how we do that, and making it defined within how your organization and culturally works. We've mentioned toolbox talks and sessions like that, training and quality management, CPD records, etc. So there's quite a breadth of evidence that can be submitted into the evidence question around how you demonstrate that you've got a management system that manages it. But it's that policy, that arrangement that's at the top end of the organization that sets that expectation right through, which is where I think we see the most challenge at the moment from an assessment perspective. Okay, anything else to add, Mark, on that one? Or Nicola? No? Okay, we'll move on to the next question. So please provide arrangements that you have in place to plan, manage, and monitor the building work you undertake to ensure the work complies with the relevant requirements. So in this scenario, it would be Building Safety Act, building regulations, and other legislation. And this one is specifically driven at principal contractors or contractors, because as you can imagine, the majority of people that go through the assessment scope at the moment are probably sitting in these two groups. Not that there's not people going through the others, but they're more predominantly in these groups. So the common reasons for rejections on these, so not addressing the duty holder role specific to them. So submissions do not outline the organisation recognises the duty holder that they've picked. So it may be they pick contractor, principal contractor, or designer, but they're not necessarily selecting the evidence correctly, and it doesn't formally kind of disclose the information that they've selected. General policies and arrangements, again going back to CDM, talk about CDM all the way through in most cases, but very little kind of scope or understanding or relevance back to building safety or the building regulations from that perspective as well. We've also got people selecting more than one duty holder, but only potentially supplying the information to one. So they pick maybe 2 or 3 of the roles, but not necessarily providing the information specific to that one that we've actually asked the question on. So therefore we have to reject. And then contractors mistakenly believe that the duty holder only belongs to the principal contractor, which actually is going to come on to another question, I think, further down as we get through this. There's a similar question to this where people believe it's just the principal contractor that should be doing it, but actually there's responsibilities for all duty holders. Mark, on this one, I'll bring up the acceptable evidence and criteria while we talk it through. But what are your thoughts and feelings on that question and the challenges around it?
I think really just go back to that central point. What is our primary obligation as a PD or contractor, sorry, a principal contractor or contractor? And central to all the legislation is that we are producing work which is compliant with building regs. So it's what, let's hold that thought centrally and then think about what we do as a company to plan, manage, and monitor what we do. Do we have coordination meetings? Do we insist on pre-let meetings, pre-starts? Do we produce progress reports for contractors or subcontractors? Do we ask for progress reports from subcontractors? Do we have a project execution plan, construction phase plan? There's a lot of different titles there, but centrally they tend to capture the same information.
Yeah.
And that's about, this is what we have done, this is what we will do, and these are challenges that we face that we've monitored. So there can be very simple mechanisms for this. internal project management meetings, project reviews, progress reports, they're all central to planning, managing, and monitoring a job. It could be that you are slightly more informal and the site super visits work and does a weekly inspection. But then it could be that that weekly inspection is recorded, evidenced, and shared. And that's another good example of how you can scale up and scale down through, which is appropriate to your business. So actually, this one is once you understood the key obligation, you can center that and pull back to standard process, which I think most of you will already do. It's just now finding the relationship to be able to produce the evidence.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. And again, going back to what we mentioned in the probably the first question, it might be that you've got things that you're putting in place and you can demonstrate that you've got the right mechanisms to do this moving forward. And that's evidence that you can submit in order to get it through the assessment criteria, at least for the first year or year two. So again, don't necessarily think about having to submit something you've already done. um, you know, we can accept and we can look at what you intend to do based on what you've changed and amended within your policies, your arrangements, your procedures, as long as we can see that within the evidence that's submitted. And again, that's really important for us. We need to get you on the ladder to do this correctly. And that means that maybe evidence comes slightly after that because of or implementation of that within a project comes slightly afterwards, based on that. Cool. Anything else to add from the guys at Cube on that one?
Not for me, thank you.
No. Okay. And the next one. So this one is a little bit more, a little bit surprising, but it kind of links back to CDM a little bit, I guess, which is please provide evidence on how you communicate or intend to communicate with the client, confirming they're aware of their duties under the Building Safety Act. So common reasons for rejections is it's a new process for contractors in relation to the building regulations, but actually communication with the client has been around for a while in the CDM regs, which might be actually something that's misconstrued or not necessarily completely understood. Misconception that it's the principal contractor's role to communicate with the client, and that only the PC is to do so. That's not technically the case within the regs. It does outline that the contractor has a responsibility to ensure that the client is aware of their arrangements and their duties. Again, the evidence doesn't relate back to building work. So some of the examples that we've been provided with relate back to appointment letters, but specifically on CDM, they don't necessarily relate back to the building regs or the Building Safety Act. And again, in terms of the evidence that then submitted within those communications, again, doesn't reference building work at all. So again, going back to the CDM regs, and not necessarily specific to what we're talking about with BSA. In terms of acceptable evidence, I'll leave that up on the page, but I know this is one we talked about, Mark, when we were doing a bit of a pre kind of talk through yesterday afternoon,
Yeah.
on this one specifically, because it's, the communication piece has been there for a while. It's not necessarily completely new, but it is in a different frame and it is in a different scope. So just interested to know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I do believe that perhaps at first sight there would appear to be barriers with contractors getting direct communication with clients, but actually I think there's ways to deal with that. And the evidence that you brought up, which was not compliant, actually provides you with some of the solutions. So the mechanism that you currently have for identifying and notifying a client regarding their obligations under CDM, it's really just a reflection of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a repeat of that document, but specific to the Building Safety Act's obligations. This is a central theme to all duty holders, whether you are a contractor, designer, principal contractor, or principal designer. Fundamentally, your primary obligation is to ensure the client is aware of their legal duties prior to commencing works. And it's how you find a mechanism to get that communication through. Is it just a clear statement that you issue? Is it something that you declare and record in a pre-start meeting or a terms of appointment? And again, going back to this theme, if this is something that you have not done, then produce a statement or a policy that evidences how you will do it moving forward. So again, I appreciate there might be some logistical challenges with this, but it doesn't stop you from promoting a solution, having a policy or a documentation that shows how you will do it moving forward.
Yeah, something else we spoke about yesterday, both with Mark and was the idea that people use the word subcontractors a lot.
Yeah.
And when they say that, they get confused by subcontractor and contractor. Just because you're a subcontractor does not mean you don't have a duty, whether that's under CDM or the Building Regulations or the Building Safety Act. If you are a subcontractor, by definition, you are a contractor.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot within our SSIP schemes, where people say, "Well, I don't need one. I'm a subcontractor." Okay, well, you're a contractor by definition if that's the case. So, that misunderstanding. And again, we are seeing that in the evidence that's been submitted, where and maybe that's playing into the yes no opt out thing as well, where people go, well, I'm not a main contractor. I'm not the main contractor. I'm a subby of a subby of a subby, and therefore I'm not in scope of the act, or I don't have a duty holder by per se. So we that's something also to consider. If you are at
Yeah.
any level in this chain, you are defined by one of those duty holders, whether you're the subcontractor
It's very clear, isn't
through
it, Tim?
seven
I mean,
levels. Yeah.
there's only two categories really, and that is either if you are on the contracting side, you're either principal contractor or a contractor.
Mhm.
And by definition, if you report to a principal contractor or contribute to the works of a principal contractor, you are a contractor. There are no subcategories. Same for designers. So it is language, it just catch people out, but you're exactly right. You're either a principal contractor or a either a principal contractor or a contractor.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And if, for those of you that have maybe fallen into that scope before, you think about it that way round that, if you're a subcontractor, take the sub bit at the front because it's not relevant to what we're talking from a duty holder perspective. So, anything else to add on that question at the moment? No?
No, thank you.
Okay, so they're the questions that we had that we really wanted to cover from an evidence perspective because they're the ones that are getting them rejected the most. But that does not mean that there aren't other questions which are challenging and causing problems by any stretch of the imagination. There are other questions, the principal design or the designer scopes that are causing problems. And the team will post a link in the chat and Q&A sessions, and maybe already have done, around our guidance documents that we have on our website. We've got two of those. So we've got one that really talks about kind of the specific criteria to each individual question. And then we've got a much broader one that talks about why we need this evidence, where has it come from, where has the question come from, how you should think about the question and what kind of evidence we're going to need. So again, really, really important documents from a PDF perspective to have open with you while you're working through the requirements. But just to talk about some general themes, just really quickly, we see across the board, and some of these have already come up, so I apologize if some of these are repeated, but not providing formal policies, some of them are statement or explanations. So again, sometimes that's okay in whatever the question might be, but we are seeing a lot of kind of just blank Word documents with an explanation stuck in the middle around what they're doing, but that doesn't show formal kind of consent within the organization that that's what the business is headed towards or trying to commit to. So if you do have something that you're intending or you've implemented, just not can't demonstrate it, please make sure it is formal in its process and the way it's driven and the way that it's evidenced within the platform. Again, going back to CDM, we're seeing a lot of references only to CDM and not to the Act or the building reg. So again, really think about what processes you've got. And I think Mark's mentioned it beautifully on a couple of questions back. Some of this might just need a tweaking and the inclusion of the word building safety or building regulations to make it a compliant piece of evidence, and maybe a couple of other tweaks that then bring that in scope. Not recognizing that there's a difference between the CDM and the BSA duty holders, not necessarily by name, but definitely in terms of the responsibilities that sit within them. So making sure you understand what those differences are and making sure that the evidence that you submit against those duty holder responsibilities are in line with that. Selecting too many duty holders, we spoke about that earlier. So making sure that you select only the ones that are applicable to your organizations or at the moment are only applicable to you. And so you're only being asked for the evidence that you need to submit against those. So if you start selecting more than that, but you're not doing it or you've not thought about it, you're going to get rejected. Selecting multiple duty holders, but only evidencing one. So again, thinking about that process of what you're submitting. If you've got a policy, it needs to reflect your responsibilities as a contractor or a designer or whatever else it might be. So again, really think about whichever one it might be. And just to add to that, what we are seeing is people tend to only write about the most senior role. So if they're a pre-C and a C or a PD and a D, they're only really referencing principal designer. They're not really then thinking about from when they only are a designer or when they only are a contractor and they're not working as the main contractor or the main principal designer. So think about it from that perspective as well. And then we've literally talked about it in the last probably question, but using generic documentation from other schemes, whether that's SSIP, whether that's other evidence you've submitted within the Common Assessment Standard or elsewhere to meet the requirements. So go back, think about that evidence. Where has it come from? What does it mean? How can I demonstrate this more cleanly in relation to the act? And how do I move forward with that at that point? So we're then going to move on to some questions. So I'm just going to unshare my screen and hopefully I can start to see some questions in the chat. And Mark, I'll just point these in your directions if that's okay. With regarding to communicating the client, confirming they're aware of duties under BSA, is this required for each project or just regular clients that can be used to be issued annually, as an example?
Yeah, I think the general approach is that with when we are proving that we are capable, part of that capability is demonstrating that we understand our obligations. There is generally a theme that we should be doing that relative to every project, because we are proving that we are capable and competent for the works we're being asked to do. So I would suggest that we follow the same logic with that. You might feel like it's a case of repetition, but actually, as we've already proven, there's an obligation to do so on every job for CDM and the appointment of a CDM PD. So if we're doing it that way, then let's incorporate it the same way. So yes, it would be for each project.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is more about location, I think, which is we're a company that supplies paving to various projects in Ireland and the UK, and therefore wanted to know if the Building Safety Act applies to us. So I can cover a little bit of that, but from our side, we can't advise you in either direction whether the Act applies to you or not. We're here to assess, and we can't get involved in the legal aspect of that. I think the bit that I'm putting out there is Ireland. Specifically, because obviously, as we know, the regulations are to England, and we see similar challenges around Scotland and Wales as well. Around my business is located in Wales, my business is located in Scotland, but we do projects within England. So, Mark, is there anything you want to add on that piece? That if you do work within the United Kingdom, I suppose, but not necessarily in England, or you're not located in England, should you be doing this, and or should you be thinking about doing it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's where the works are carried out, isn't it? Because they're governed by the local legislation. We've done some work with colleagues and friends in devolved nations, and of course, whilst they're not governed by the same legislation and in their own patch, they are working in under the new building regulations, and therefore the regulations apply to the works they do. So yes, product supply only is something slightly different that. To be fair, we are not massively involved in, but it's really about if you are involved in the installation of works, anything that requires compliance with building regs is the governing factor. And of course, you are governed by the building regulations in England.
Cool. Okay. Let me pick another one. We work exclusively under a main contractor who allocates the work to us. Um, would a, would their quality submission system be accepted as evidence? So I'm assuming that question is, would we be able to submit their evidence in order for us to meet the requirement? I think from our perspective, it's what you are doing, not what necessarily others are doing. So we talked about it in a couple of questions at the start around kind of it's not just about your workforce or what you do, it's also about how you work with subcontractors or main contractors as well. So while the main contractor would have a policy or procedure or arrangements to make sure that you are doing as you are within their processes, you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that through their processes because it's what you need to be doing. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything else you want to add to that question specifically.
No, but I just think you take the positive out of that situation, don't you? Whilst you're working within a framework, somebody else's framework of quality, by definition, you are interacting and being a part of a process. What you can do, therefore, is extract your part in that process and say, this is what we do,
Yeah.
and this is how we do it.
Okay. Um, might not be able to answer all this completely, but we install on new build industrial warehouses where the cladding system is non-combustible, so there is no pre-existing combustible material. I mean, there's no other part to that, but I'm assuming that means would we potentially be in scope, or do we need to be thinking about being in scope?
I'll be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure what the question is there. So, what are the works that they do? Sorry.
We install on new build industrial warehouses where the cladding systems is non-combustible.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, yes. I mean, the simple answer is yes, because you are doing works which are governed by building regs. You are not doing works which are they're not uncontrolled, are they? They are controlled works, and therefore, by definition, need to meet the functional requirements of building regs. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, and we'll pick one more if that's okay, which is we're a demolition contractor. If the structure is 6 stories with a plant room on the roof, is this class as 7 stories? And I think this one goes back to, I think we had a case, was it late last year, where there was a building that had a garden on a roof and the judge went one way and the regulator
That's
went
right.
another. Um, yeah, it's probably one of those classic questions where it's probably needs to be, you need to go back to your principal contractor or go and find out from your local body. But Mark, is anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, generally it's accepted that buildings where there is a roof area or a floor level at the highest point, which is dedicated solely to plant, that area does not
Yeah.
contribute to the measurable space. So you would therefore measure to the floor level of the highest usable floor level below that. So ultimately, you are determined by the measure rather than the inclusion of a plant space.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Mark. And thank you for all your questions. The team have been trying to answer as many of those as we've been going through the webinar today, and hopefully they've been able to answer most of them. If they haven't, the team will be going through them at the end of today and trying to get back to you via email to confirm the answers to the questions that you've had. So thank you very much. Before we end the webinar today, just 2 last slides really from me on what should you now starting to be think about. Take your time to understand each question. Don't rush the question. You know, if it means going back to your internal teams to review, or if it means going externally to get better, more support on what that means. One of the things we do hear a lot of at the moment is I'm going to a consultant or an advisor, and maybe they're looking at health and safety specifically. They really don't know whether the building regs I should be doing in X direction. So really make sure you find the right person that can support you with that. And I think what's been demonstrated through today and last week is that Cube have got those expertise if it's needed. But there's also plenty of other organisations out there that will be doing the same type of tasks as well. Use our guidance has been provided, and hopefully that's in the chat that all of you can see. Review your internal policies and procedures and your documentation, and prepare that evidence. But don't rush the submission. If you rush it, all that will happen is you get rejected, and then you end up going back around the cycle again. So please make sure you review the evidence that you have, make sure it's fit for purpose, and then only at the point where you think you have a really good submission, submit, and then we'll provide feedback on that. And then just lastly, those key takeaways. If you've not already done so, make sure you understand if the Act applies to you. Be aware of this mandatory deadline that's coming. October the 1st for the main contractors is their deadline. And if you've got any questions on that, if you are in any of their supply chains, make sure you do reach out and understand what that impact is to you and your organization, or potentially could be. As we said all the way through, seek support and prepare your answers. And that is absolutely everything for today. So we would like to thank everyone for joining us. Hopefully you've learned a lot about the kind of the process of the requirement, how the questions flow, and how you can work through. I would like to send a massive thank you to the guys at Cube Construction Consultants, to Mark and Nicole for all the great all the great work that you've done over the last couple of weeks with us and on these webinars. It's been great to work with you on it, and we hope you continue that in the future. So thank you very much. And as we said, if you've had any questions that we've not been able to answer, we will continue to answer those in the coming couple of hours. So thank you very much for today, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.